Those of you who've been to previous conferences here, I have this perennial problem of getting someone to introduce Joseph Pearce. We tried this and we tried that. He keeps coming back. I asked a couple people, rang a couple doorbells, sent emails, and I got no response. Some of them had moved. So I thought, okay, well, I'll ask Dale, and Dale said, no, I'm tired of Joseph Pearce. He always gets top billing, and I'm sick and tired of him. And then I asked Chris Chack, and he said he wanted to renegotiate his speaker's fee. And I thought, no, I'm not getting into that stuff. Forget it. If you recall, a couple years ago, I made the heinous mistake of having John Finucane. As I said, my hand to God, I forgot John is Irish. I forgot. Anyway, you might not know that John is the bard of the Rochester, New York Chesterton Society. Those of you who don't know what a bard is, he writes poetry. So we thought, fine, we'll have John's poem, and we'll use that to introduce Mr. Pearce, at least in part. But in order to do this poem properly, I have to bring both of these gentlemen up here. And you've got an Englishman and an Irishman, they've got to get along when they're up here. So if I could have you, Joseph, and John, please come up here. These two there. John's got this thing, right? I mean, this Irish thing, about the English. I mean, just because they've been persecuted and put down and robbed, murdered, and pillaged for centuries, he's got this grudge. John, get over it. And if you know me, you know how much of a lie it is, because I'm part Slavic, and we don't forget anything. We don't even like the Greeks, and we don't even remember what they did. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's an aside. The title of this poem by the bard, believe it or not, is called The Odd Couple. All right, and you got to figure out which one is being talked to at the same time, although there's one point of confusion if you know John Finucane. An Irishman and Englishman, one tall, one not as tall. One was very erudite, the other you'd think God should recall. One had hair and one was bald. The hair did not enhance one's height, and contrary to local lore, baldness does not diffuse the light. One espoused his lofty thoughts, the other was a spouse. John, you wrote this. You had to deal with this. One did roam the country wide, the other hardly left the house. One spoke, now this is what puzzled me, one spoke English fluently, one was hard to understand. The English that the English spoke was clarified by an Irishman. One did quote the ancient poets, one did try to make words rhyme. At a Chesterton Conference they met. They seemed to have a good old time. 'Twas by their accents they stood out. They did not sound at all like the others, and at the conference found out in faith, discerned that they were brothers. The Odd Couple. Joseph, you stop now. Joseph, you may as well stay here because I gotta finish this thing. There's an error in the program too, by the way. Joseph Pearce is now at St. Thomas More College in New Hampshire. The difficulty, here, I mean, we're talking about history, right? Here's a man with a history. if you know any of his conversion story, which I hope to heck he never writes down and writes a book about. It was his second term in prison in which he discovered G.K. Chesterton. It was in solitary confinement, but you've probably heard that story. Anyway, Joseph's written like too many books to read. I mean, books, and I had to write down. I had to start, writing down a list like G.K. Chesterton, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Hilaire Belloc, Oscar Wilde, Solzhenitsyn. I don't know. I missed about 6 of them. Some poetry and book on distributism. Small is still beautiful. I mean, that's why Dale doesn't want to introduce him, because he's jealous. In any event, it is a great privilege to have Joseph here, and without further ado, I'm going to give him the microphone.
But it's good to be back. I'm a little bit disappointed because one of the things challenges I try to rise to every year is to see if my talk is anywhere near as exciting as the insults thrown at me during the introduction. It's a bit of a challenge, but I found that was very, very friendly, which is a bit disconcerting. I don't know what to do now. People like me here. It's had to come back 8 times for people to realise what a wonderful bloke I am, but there you are. Okay, I think I can walk with this, can't I presume? I'll take it off. It's going to work still. Let's try it. Okay. Yeah, you still hear me. Good. I'm very impressed, by the way, that Christopher Check left the mic behind, gave the rest of his talk out here, including quoted poetry, and speaking for myself anyway, I was over in the wings over there, I could hear everything he said, which I'm tempted to try to do the same thing, but I'm not going to. I'm going to use the mic. But this is, I think the title of the talk that Lou's given is Real England. And Real England is much better than the fake England, the same way that real ale is much better than fake ale. And the England that I don't consider myself to be a part of is the historical equivalent of Bud Light. I'm not going to talk about that England, I'm going to talk about the real England. And by the real England, I mean the true England. So the subtitle, if you like, of my talk is A History of True England. Now, I want to make a clarification here. A history of true England is not a true history of England. Right? That's not to say, by the way, that what I'm about to talk about is a lie. What it means is that to give a true history of England in a completely objective sense, looking at the whole picture, the good, the bad, the ugly, the Christians, the atheists, the pagans, look at the whole thing would be a huge volume, a huge job for a great historian, and I'm not a great historian, and we only have 45 minutes. But what I want to talk about is true England, which is that part of England that's remained true to the truth, true to the Catholic faith. I'm reminded, when I give my conversion story, and I did give it here a few years ago, I don't know how many years ago now, the conferences sort of blur into one sort of glorious, slightly inebriated whole. It's great. When I give my conversion story, I quote the line from Shakespeare that was the motto of my school back in England, my really bad high school I went to. And that motto was, "This above all to thine own self be true." The words of Polonius from Hamlet. And if you remember, the motto of my school said, "This above all to thine own self be true, William Shakespeare." And I thought, well, Shakespeare's the greatest Englishman who ever lived. If that's what Shakespeare believed, that's what I'll believe. I took it to be my own personal motto with disastrous consequences, and as Lou mentioned, including two prison sentences. But what I didn't realise at the time, of course, and what my ignorant school didn't realise, is that they are not Shakespeare's words. Well, they are. He wrote them, but he put them into the mouth of Polonius, who's a blithering idiot. And that philosophy is one of the subplots of Hamlet, that philosophy leads to disaster. The philosophy of relativism, in other words, the only truth is yourself, leads to disaster. It leads to Polonius's own death. It leads to the death of the person to whom he gives that advice, Laertes, his son. It leads to the death of his, or to madness and then death of his daughter. So that the England that's true to itself, whatever that is, and when a nation starts worshipping itself, it's got a narcissistic problem. But the England that remains true to itself is a bad England. As an America remains true to itself, in other words, true to its own self-image, without relating to God and His church, is also going in the wrong direction. So what I want to talk about here is the England that remains true to the truth beyond itself. An England that knows it's part of a bigger picture, that it belongs as part of Christendom, as part of the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth, en route to heaven. However, what it isn't is a history of Catholic England, in the sense, I know that Christopher Check sort of said, when he talked about a history of true England, well, that ended with the Norman Conquest in 1066. So, you know, what exactly is Catholic England? Well, we can talk about that. It's not a history of Catholic England because, well, it is and it isn't, because it's not a history of only that England when England professed as a nation to being Catholic, which basically ended with the English Reformation. It's a history of those Englishmen who have remained true to the church right through to the present day. So a history of true England is a history that's still going on today. And that's the history I want to try to give over the next 40 minutes or so. So it's a history of English Catholics. And it's also a history which is made to correct what Hilaire Belloc called that tomfool Protestant history that's distorted the whole understanding of English history. And as was mentioned earlier, of course, that tomfool Protestant history to which Belloc refers is also the view of British history that Americans have been brought up with, the waspish understanding of the history of England. So I want to go back to the beginning of the story, if you like, and actually the beginning of the story goes back to before England, if we take England to be the land of the Angles, Angleland. But I want to go back to the time of the Roman occupation of what could be called Britain then, or Albion. And the first English martyr goes back to the time of the Roman persecution of the Christian church in the early centuries. The Romans were in England from 50 AD to about 450 AD, so for 400 years. In that period, the martyrdom that was besetting the whole of the Roman Empire also got to England, and the first English martyr is St. Alban. There's a town in Hertfordshire named after him, St. Albans in Hertfordshire. So for me, a history of true England, I date back to pre-England, before the nation was even called England, when it was called Albion. And then, when the Romans left, in around 450 AD, the Anglo-Saxons moved in, and that's where the name, say, Angleland comes. And so there's a period, the historians tell you, of paganism in England, and that's only partly true, because the Christianity that was planted in England by the arrival of the Romans and the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire remained. And particularly remained stronger in the north and the west of the country. Basically, the further you got from Londinium, the further you got from London, where the Anglo-Saxons basically settled in the southeast of the country and then spread upwards, the more that Christianity remained. So there was a period of paganism, if you like, that took over the south and east of England, but there's a residual Christianity which remained, particularly in the north. St. Gregory the Great, a wonderful saint, was alleged to have seen some English people, and even in those days the English were as good looking as me, as hard as it is to believe. And he said, "Who are those people, are the strikingly beautiful people?" And so he said, "Well, they're from Angleland, the land of the Angles." And St. Gregory the Great said, "Angles?" I can't use that. I can't really do the Latin. I'm sorry, forgotten it. But if the Angles, they're did someone know it?
Non angli sed angeli.
Okay, not angles but angels. So St. Gregory the Great had a great, should we say, desire to see these pagan English become angels by having them received into the church, and sent St. Augustine of Canterbury, as distinct from St. Augustine of Hippo, to England at the end of the 6th century to evangelise the pagan Saxons. The St. Austin Review, yeah, you wondered how long I'd get into the talk before the first commercial break. The St. Austin Review, the magazine that I edit, which is on sale out there for a discount rate of $5 for people here, was actually named after St. Augustine of Canterbury. Austin is an English abbreviation of Augustine. So the Austin Friars are the Augustinian friars. So you have St. Austin of Hippo and then St. Austin of Canterbury, St. Augustine of Canterbury, who came over and converted the pagan Saxons. And then we have the Synod of Whitby. The Whitbys in the northeast of the country, which united the residue of the Christians that had been there since Roman times with the new Christians of the south, the Saxon Christians, and reconciled, because one was following the Celtic calendar for Easter, the other was following the Roman calendar, and the two came together and agreed to follow the same calendar. So that was the uniting of the two sections of what we might call English Catholicism. Then we have the great Alfred the Great. Of course, at the Chesterton Conference, we can't not mention Alfred the Great within the context of the history of true England. Chesterton's monumental poem, The Ballad of the White Horse, of course, celebrating and paying tribute to Alfred the Great. But a great scholar, amongst other things, translated Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy into English from Latin, as well as being a great soldier. I mean, this is the sort of people that Christopher Chet was talking about. These are the la creme of Christendom, people that could be scholars and soldiers, that could dance even on the way to battle. I can't dance even on the way from battle. As my wife will tell you, it's one of her best efforts. And then we have what you might call the age of the English saints. And this might have been what Christopher Chet was referring to when he talked about maybe the golden age of England ending with the Norman conquest. Because there's a whole array, a whole army of wonderful saints with wonderful unpronounceable names. From that golden age, if you like, that 500 years, 600 years, 700 years in fact, from the arrival of St. Austin and the arrival of the Normans, a wonderful period. I wrote a poem. I was organised and I brought it in with me. Actually, is there someone at the back there that could do that? Thanks, Dad. My book, you know my small book of poetry? Thank you. I'm just not organised here. But I wrote a poem actually that sums up, and this is just because I felt somewhat uncomfortable with John Finucane getting too friendly with me. So I'm going to read this as a completely needless provocation. It's about one of those saints from that period called St. Withburger. Thank you. Put this down for a second. So the enmity will soon be rekindled, John. Where are we? What is it called? Oh yes, The Bishop and the Virgin. Now, that's an interesting title for a poem. It's okay. It's perfectly safe.
Can you give the title again? I don't think everyone heard.
You didn't hear it? It'd be a great pleasure to give the title again. It's the beginning of a blue joke called The Bishop and the Virgin. As the bishop said to the Virgin. So the Bishop and the Virgin. Here we go. The bishop rose in the west, the most famous Celt of all, and the faith devoutly was confessed from Cork to Donegal. But the Virgin sank in the east, though risen from the fall, and though all of England knows her least, she is worthier than them all. Patrick preached on Irish sod, the shamrock 1 in 3. He turned the pagan Gaels to God, till they all were one in thee. With Berga, princess pure and saint, daughter of a Saxon Rex, East Anglian, holy without taint, iconic image of her sex. Patrick's Day is celebrated in manners quite obscene by men whose faith is mutilated in 40 shades of green. With Berga's Day is now forgotten, as indeed is she, by England turned rancid and rotten, footloose, fancy, and unfree. As Patrick is remembered by policemen in New York, and policemen are dismembered by rebels from Dundalk, I remember England, merry, good, and free, and March 17th is with Berga's Day to me. I assume that only the non-Irish Americans are clapping. Seriously, I love Ireland. My maternal grandmother's a Kavanagh. It was really more, if you actually listen to it carefully, apart from the dig at the IRA, was a lament at England's loss of faith, and the fact that St. Withburga is forgotten and St. Patrick is not forgotten, and St. Patrick's Day is celebrated and St. Withburga's Day is not. It's my call, if you like, for that remembrance. But then at the end of that period, before the Norman conquest, we had this wonderful saint king. Again, another example of Christendom, the saint king, or the king saint. St. Edward the Confessor, who's immortalized, not merely, of course, in the most important sense of being in eternity with Christ and his saints and interceding for us, but immortalized in a lesser but nonetheless sublime sense of being mentioned by Shakespeare in Macbeth, where St. Edward the Confessor is held up as the vision of the perfect Christian king, as opposed to Macbeth, the Machiavellian, self-serving monster. And it seems that Shakespeare is showing us there are two visions of kingship here. One which serves God and neighbour, and one which serves self and destroys neighbour. I also just, one I'm in the mood for being controversial. Doesn't see the thing I now know from Lou, doesn't matter how much they insult me, I just keep coming back anyway, so what have I got to lose? But I sometimes sort of say something just to get a reaction. And one I said, the thing about monarchy is that it really depends upon the virtue of the king. If you have a good king, like St. Edward the Confessor, you have great government. You have a great government, a stable government for a long time, if the king is blessed with long life, 40 or 50 years. If you have a bad king, of course, you have a tyranny. A horrible place. The only good thing about it is you know that there's a hope that the tyranny will disappear when the king dies. With democracy, at least the form of democracy under which we live now, you have guaranteed bad government forever. I would add, by the way, in case you think my word is stepping on all sorts of things here, I did write a book. This would be another commercial break, but I don't have any to sell, so it's a rather pointless one. But I did write a book called Small is Still Beautiful, when there's 2 chapters in that. I think one's called A Return to True Democracy and A Democracy of Small Areas, and making democracy democratic. I'm in favour of democracy, but I want democracy to be democratic again. And the current usurping of power by central government is undemocratic and it's getting worse. So, and then at the very as the sun setting on Saxon England, if you like, with this wonderful saintly king, Edward the Confessor, we also have a Marian apparition, and this of course follows on very comfortably from David Higby's talk about Our Lady of Fatima, because in 1064, is that correct? I think it was 1064, it's literally a year or two before the conquest. A noble lady in Norfolk in England had an apparition of the Blessed Virgin at Walsingham. And Our Lady of Walsingham, I think I'm correct in saying, in good Chestertonian fashion, by the way, I wrote this on the way up on the plane yesterday, I haven't checked any facts. But I think I'm correct in saying that Our Lady of Walsingham is the oldest Marian shrine in Christendom. So over, 950 years old now, as a Marian shrine, destroyed by Henry VIII in the 1500s and resurrected at the end of the 19th century during the Catholic revival. And I lived within 20 or 30 miles from it for the last 11 years I was in England. I would cycle there often, and on occasion, particularly during Lent, would walk there. And again, it was a wonderful experience to be walking through small country lanes with no traffic, nothing but a rosary, and following in the pilgrim footsteps of so many Christians over so many centuries. And then we have the Norman Conquest, 1066. I gathered, although I haven't had a chance to talk to Christopher Check about this, I gathered that he thinks this was a bad thing. I'd like to discuss it more with him. What I want to do one day, and maybe I'll get Christopher Check to write for it, there might be some moment of inspiration. I'd like to have a theme issue of the Zoroastrian Review on 1066 of all that. Was it good, was it bad? But what I would like to say by way of an anecdote is something that happened in the 20th century. Hilaire Belloc was giving a lecture in Oxford on 1066, on the Norman Conquest. And in the audience was J.R.R. Tolkien, who was taken there, went there with Father Martin Darcy, one of the most famous Jesuits of the 20th century. And Belloc waxed lyrical and historical and wistful. But for him, 1066 was wonderful because the Normans brought French Catholicism to England. That the French, the Normans, united England more solidly with the Catholic theme, or Rome, if you like. This is Belloc's position. J.R.R. Tolkien left that meeting absolutely livid, angry, disagreeing with Belloc's critique. And Martin Darcy, Father Darcy, said, well, why don't you sort of put your hand up? And Tolkien basically said, Belloc's a better debater than I am. He would probably shoot me down in flames. But nonetheless, Tolkien considered him to be wrong. Now for Tolkien, this period that I've just spoken about was the golden age of English Catholicism, that England was very Catholic before the Normans arrived, did not need the Normans to bring the benefits of Roman Catholicism. They already had them. And for Tolkien, who loves the Germanic Anglo-Saxon heritage, as opposed to Belloc, who thinks that France is the best thing that God ever made, with possible exception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Again, it's slightly exaggerating, and I could go on a tangent about why Belloc is so militant in its defense of the French perspective on history, but the third commercial break is it's all covered in great depth in my biography of Hilaire Belloc, and I don't have time to talk about it now. But 1066, something to be debated, disputed, but the important thing is, England, if you go back to the days of St. Alban, had had a Catholic presence already for 700 years by the time of the Norman Conquest, and England remained Catholic for another 450 years after the Norman Conquest. So it's not a breach in the history of true England. In the midst of that period between the Norman Conquest and the English Reformation, we have the martyrdom of St. Thomas of Becket. Now, the wonderful thing about that, first of all, is its timelessness. St. Thomas Becket and St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher serve as potent reminders to us today that we cannot serve two masters. We cannot serve God and Caesar. We now live in a situation in this country where they're trying to make it compulsory to serve Caesar instead of God. And if you want to make the choice, they're making it illegal to make the choice, making conscience an act against the law. It's all been done before. And St. Thomas Becket was a victim of that, St. John Fish was a victim of that, and St. Thomas More was a victim of that, and countless others in other countries, of course. Canterbury became a shrine of Christendom. And again, I think I'm correct in saying that the great medieval shrines uniting the Christian world, uniting Christendom, were Jerusalem, the Holy Land, Rome, obviously, Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in Spain, Canterbury in England, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and Walsingham, the shrine of the Blessed Virgin. So two of the major shrines of Christendom were in England, especially if you bear in mind that for people from Europe to go there, medieval times, this is on the hinterland, it's on the edge of Europe, it's a long way to go. You know, major pilgrimage shrine sites. But at the same time, or shortly after Thomas of Becket, towards the end of the medieval period, we have the example of Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Chaucer is profoundly Catholic, profoundly Orthodox. He presents to us a cross-section of English life. And what do we see? We see what David Higby talked about this morning. There's always the minority, even in a Catholic country and a Catholic culture, who really make the effort to live holy lives, who really try to take that narrow path. So you see the assemblage of miserable humanity in England at the time, miserable sinners. And we hear their tales, the wife of Bath, the miller, etc. But in the midst of that, amongst the pilgrims, we have the parson. And the parson, as described to us by Chaucer in the prologue, is the epitome of the perfect priest. He is a saint. He is the model of what all Catholic priests should be. And the parson has a brother, the ploughman. And the ploughman is the epitome of what every layman should be. The perfect layman, living in harmony with the church, living in harmony with the teaching of the church, and both of them quite clearly as saints. The saintly priest, the saintly layman. So we get this minority, but they're there, if you like, as the thin thread running through the history of England and every other nation. So one thing I also don't want to make a habit of is agreeing with George Bernard Shaw, particularly the Chesterton Conference. And the only get out I get is I'm not really agreeing with him, I'm just pretending to. But Shaw famously said, the only golden rule is there is no golden rule. And what I would say is that I amend that only because of course there are golden rules. One of them is not to be Bernard Shaw. I would say the only golden rule is there is no golden age. Now we have to remember that. It's very easy for us to evoke certain periods of the past as being perfect. Every period of the past has been full of miserable sinners. The sin of Adam and Eve runs through every generation of humanity and every nation of humanity, and will do so until the end of time. Heaven is not to be found on earth. But in every generation we have this thin thread of sanctity, the lives of the saints, both those formally canonized and those many others, of course, that have never been formally recognized by the church. So one thing history teaches us is, you know, what's happening now is not all that different from what's been happening always. And that allows us to see things with a clearer perspective. The world's not about to end. The world's only going to end when God decides it. Not until then. Between now and then, we will be fighting, as Tolkien said, as Christopher Check alluded to, the long defeat, with only occasional glimpses of final victory. Okay, let me get the English Reformation. And the important thing about that is the English Reformation is very different from the European Reformation. The European Reformation was a Reformation based upon ideas, heresy, if you like. Now, Luther and Calvin sincerely thought that what they believed was correct and what the Catholic Church was teaching was wrong. The Catholic Church sincerely believed that what he taught was right and what Luther and Calvin taught was wrong. This was a battle, a war fought on theology. One side's right, one side's wrong. In England, the king was a Catholic. He'd written in defense of the seven sacraments of the church. He'd been given the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, by the Pope. But he was more interested ultimately in being true to himself than being true to the truth beyond himself. So the English Reformation was an act of egotism, an act of egocentrism on the part of Henry VIII, and on the part of his ministers, by the way, because if you just did what he wanted, you got loads of land. The church land was up for grabs, and he gave it to his friends, those who were his allies. It was a Machiavellian revolution. Fairly shortly after, Machiavelli had actually written The Prince. And I say here in the College of St. John Fisher College, we need to remember St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, and Thomas More's famous lines, "I am the king's good servant, but God's first." And again, powerful words, because that's what we're being asked now as Catholics in modern America. Whose good servant are we, the king's or the president's, or God's? And if the president and the federal government forces us to choose, where does our choice lie? Well, St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More, it laid very clearly that they were God's servant first, and they paid with it with their lives. We then had 150 years of age of martyrdom. This is the true England to which I owe my loyalty. This, by the way, is the true England that unites England with the true Ireland. The land of martyrs, those persecuted for their faith. In this sense, I am fully on the side of the Irish, because my own ancestors, as a true Englishman, were also persecuted. From the 1530s to the 1680s, they were put to death, and brutal, bloody death, hanging, drawing, and quartering, which I'm not going to elaborate on, but a horrible way to die, almost as bad as some of the ways that the Muslims dealt with the Christians that Christopher Check was telling us about. And then we have, at the same time, the age of Shakespeare, and the Catholic genius of William Shakespeare, and how at the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign we have this hanging on in there for the death of the Queen, in the hope that King James I, who's married to a Catholic, will come to the throne, will be much more tolerant towards the Catholics. Hang on in there, the Queen's an old woman, she's going to die. And then the Queen dies, and Shakespeare plays for a short period, seemed to have full of this elation, very short-lived, because within a year, the persecution becomes as bad as ever. And then we have Shakespeare's darkest plays, King Lear and Macbeth and Othello, being written around this time, where Catholics now realise the persecution is going to carry on for another 30 or 40 years until King James dies. And that despair led to the hot-headedness that led to terrorism and the gunpowder plot, 1605, which was set up by the government. Now, I sometimes say be provocative. I used to say this in England, to be provocative with my non-Catholic friends, whenever because in England, as you know, on November the 5th, they build bonfires and burn effigies of Guy Fawkes, even to this day, even though most of them are so ignorant they don't know who he is. And I used to say, that's fine, carry on with the liturgy of St. Guy of Westminster. And every good Christian should try to blow up the Houses of Parliament every day, it'd be much better. Of course, that's not strictly true, it's just me being provocative again. But it is true that we should be sceptical about big government. We should not succumb to terrorism or violence in the way that Guy Fawkes, as a dupe, and his colleagues were dupes of the British government, English government, who set the whole thing up and arrested them red-handed. Of course, that allowed them to say, see, look, we told you these Catholics were traitors. So the one small group of terrorists become the excuse for the state to persecute every single Catholic. Well, I need to move on because we're running out of time here. After 150 years of putting Catholics to death, in 1688 we had what is called the Glorious Revolution. Think about that. Glorious Revolution. Of course, all revolutionaries think their revolution is glorious. The communist or the Russian Revolution was a glorious revolution. History is written by the victors. But see, even the victors admit it was a revolution, that the true king was removed, a usurper was put in his place. We don't have a true king in England ever since then. James II was removed because he was a Catholic. Finally defeated the Battle of Boyne, 1690. I'm a Jacobite, which means that I believe that the true king of England is in exile. And like Tolkien, like the people in Middle-earth, I'm awaiting the return of the king. So we had two Jacobite uprisings in the 18th century, attempts to put the true king back on the throne that were crushed by true Englishmen and true Scotsmen. We also have, by the way, in the midst of all of this persecution, continuing a Catholic literary presence. Richard Crashaw, who converted and then was forced into exile, the poet. John Dryden, another convert, great poet. Alexander Pope. But by the end of the 18th century, there were only a fragment of Catholics left in England. A remnant, a reticent remnant. A few tens of thousands. By this time, 300 years of relentless persecution had almost destroyed true England. And then we have the Catholic revival. That's a different talk, I may have given it here before. I'm not going to say much about it now because of time. But it begins with Romanticism, with a rejection of the scientism and the relativism of the Enlightenment. And from that comes the Gothic revival, the pre-Raphaelite movement in art, and the Oxford movement in the Church of England, all of which are manifestations of what might be called neo-medievalism, the rediscovery of the medieval. And then we have the Catholic revival that comes from that. And in the 150 years since then, at 1845, the conversion of Newman can be seen as the turning point. We have Gerard Manley Hopkins, arguably the greatest poet the English language in the last 200 years. We have G.K. Chesterton, of course, Hilaire Belloc, the great war poet Siegfried Sassoon, T.S. Eliot, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene. And I'm leaving lots of people out. Culminating with the great J.R.R. Tolkien, with The Lord of the Rings, voted repeatedly in opinion polls as the greatest work of the 20th century, more recently by a poll held by Amazon.com as the greatest work of all time. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has gone, it's boldly gone, when no one else has gone into cyberspace and has conquered that as well. So the greatest work of recent years, written by a Catholic, a lifelong practicing Catholic, who called the Lord of the Rings a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So Catholicism seemed to have been killed off and then was resurrected in the 19th century in such glorious ways, in which, if you like, the Lord of the Rings is the icing on the cake. And just to conclude, how does the story end? History of true England. Well, as Christopher Dawson said in the quote that Lou gave at the beginning, which I meant to ask you that I could read, so I'm not going to worry about it now, but basically how history is where time meets eternity. And the other image of time being the seed of, history being the seed of eternity in time or something, yeah, something like that. But the point is where time meets eternity, because we have to see history through the eyes of eternity, because that's where reality ultimately is. All right? Because for God, there's no future and no past, there's only the omnipresence, always present. For us, we can't know what the future is, we live in the past, but we're destined for eternity. The false England is hell. You can see it, it's already there. If you don't believe in hell, go to England. And true England is already in heaven. Alfred the Great's in heaven. St. Edward the Confessor's in heaven. Our Lady of Walsingham, I'm not going to claim that Our Lady of Walsingham is an English lady, but she did appear in England. Of course, she's the Queen of Heaven. True England's already in heaven, and future generations of true Englishmen are destined for heaven. So like all true stories, the story of true England has a happy ending, and that the true English are living happily ever after. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Just a couple reminders. We have this